speaking from the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects and indeed give my gratitude to the First Nations people. I always feel so fortunate that I live in a country where I can access First Nations stories and songlines. Lucia, what a treat to have you here on a brisk London morning, speaking to me over here in the evening twilight. Hello and
Yes.
welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here, and it's really nice to be speaking to people in Australia. I miss Australia so much. So I'm very grateful that you're all here, and thank you, Chris.
Well, we miss you. I mean, when I was sort of reading and researching, I was researching you. I was so astonished by how much you had achieved in your life. I want to read out a little, like you have been, a journalist, an essay, a writer, a legal researcher, but you've had work published literally all over the world in so many different journals. When you sort of reflect on your life of writing, is there something that you're proud of? What's the thing that you're the most proud of?
Oh, what a lovely question. And thank you so much for saying that and for asking that question. Yes, there is. The thing that I am the most proud of, definitely, that I've ever written is the essay I Choose Elena, which turned into my first book.
And so that came out at the start of 2020. Is that right?
Yes.
But you first had it published in Mood Indigo sort of journal, and then it took on a life. Can you explain to our listeners how it took on a life of its own?
Yeah. So this is, I think the reason I'm the most proud of this is because it was very, very unexpected. I was working as a journalist, and I started my career as a journalist as a gender reporter. So I was covering gender issues. I was covering domestic violence and sexual violence.
I mean, they just threw you right in, didn't they? They just threw you right in.
Yes, exactly. Which is exactly what I wanted. But despite the fact that I was covering these things every day, I was not able to acknowledge to myself that I myself had been sexually assaulted as a teenager. And there was a kind of very slow process by which I started to kind of acknowledge and accept this fact. And this was all happening in 2017, 2018. This was 10 years after the assault happened. I had ignored it for 10 years. I had told no one. I didn't tell the police. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell a doctor. I just went back to my life. And then 10 years later, basically in that time, I became very ill with chronic illnesses. I was in and out of hospital. And it had been suggested to me a few times that those illnesses might be connected to physical trauma. But I ignored it when that was suggested to me because I didn't want to think about this night, about the horrible thing that had happened to me. I felt ashamed of it. I felt like it was my fault. I felt like I'd done something to deserve it. And so then 10 years later, I was still sick, and I decided one day that it might be the time to tell someone what happened to me. And the reason I did that is because I got to this point where I thought, I'll do anything to get better. I'll do anything to kind of get my physical health back, even if that means breaking this, solemn promise that I made to myself.
For those that don't know, Lucia, getting back to your physical self was really important because you had been sort of on the world stage as a gymnast. You were someone that relied on your physical strength and your vitality, if you like, in your body.
Yes, absolutely. So I was a very competitive gymnast. I was at an elite level. I'd been to world championships. I was then training for world championships when I had an injury that was kind of directly after the assault, which ended my gymnastics career. So I had this very strange shift in my life where I went from being very, very physically active and strong and powerful to losing gymnastics, and then also losing my physical health. When I got sick, my body started to break down. So when I decided I would do anything to get better, and I was going to tell someone about this assault, I told my doctors, and then this whole world opened up to me, where my doctors referred me to specialists, physical therapists, psychiatrists, who all helped me recover from this trauma 10 years after the fact. And it just was amazing to me when I was going into all these appointments, how much information I did not know about the long-term effects of sexual assault, even as someone who had covered this issue as a reporter, and I thought, if I don't even know this, then what hope is there for everyone else to know it? And it's so important. There's all these resources out there. There's people who dedicated their whole lives to helping people recover from these things. And they're all hidden because we don't talk about it enough. And so then I started, in these appointments, I started taking notes as if I was reporting a story.
And can I ask you here at this sort of stage, that you like there you are, perhaps, and you do talk about this in your book, almost as almost a bit of an out-of-body experience. Like you've already said, you started taking notes like a journalist. You started, but what were you feeling when you were taking those notes? Were they feelings of anger, or were they, what was happening for you at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really interesting thing to reflect on. I think I was holding my emotions at a distance at that point.
Yeah.
Which is something I've learned to do quite well.
Yeah.
And I was still doing then. So I think at this stage, it was still all very new to me. And part of what I was doing when I was taking notes, like I was a reporter, was trying to create emotional distance between myself and the story.
I was invisible wall.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was a kind of step-by-step thing. I think that was a step on the way to being able to properly feel what I felt, which happened a bit later, and it turns out was, a lot of anger and hurt and regret and all those sorts of things.
I'm so interested in it because you wrote this essay, it got taken off, got created into a book, and My Body Keeps Your Secrets is kind of the end result of this journey of you feeling courageous enough to be able to tell your story and share your story. But it's much more than that, isn't it? Like, you've gone into it as a journalist, so you have decided that the way to approach your own trauma is to gather stories from other people.
Yes, exactly. So yes, I published this first essay, and then I published in the ABC and in the Lifted Brow, and that was kind of the pulling together of everything I had learned from all these appointments, and me trying to process my own trauma. That was that first essay, and I didn't expect that anyone would read it, but then it got turned into a book, and that was the first book. And that really,
and the book title, for those that are taking notes tonight, is I Chose Eleanor. Still available.
Yes. And because that book was quite specifically about that story, it had to be about me. It had to kind of start and end with my story and the research I could do around that. And coming out of that, the thing that really struck me was that there is so much more to this story about trauma and recovery than my own experience. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I'm very conscious that, my experience of sexual assault was actually statistically very unusual. It was committed by someone I don't know in the middle of the night. It was one of those it falls into what we call the monster myth idea, that is actually kind of the least common type of sexual assault. What we know is that the vast majority of people who are assaulted by people they know, people they trust, people who are supposed to take care of them. And those boundaries can be much, much harder to define. And I knew that my story was not representative, and that there were so many other stories of trauma that looked different to mine. And I got hundreds and hundreds of emails from people who said, what happened to me isn't as bad as what happened to you. And that I heard that again and again. But what I knew from all my specialists is that that's not true. Trauma is, it doesn't matter what the actual event is or the severity of the actual event. Trauma affects us all in the same way. And so I didn't want people to feel like if they didn't have this stranger in the night experience, then this research about trauma and recovery might not be applicable to them. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does make sense. And it's certainly something that I want to come back to because, I mean, very clearly in your book, My Body Keeps Your Secrets, you do talk about a whole range of emotions, but you also talk about a whole range of situations. And I do in particular want to talk about the sort of the class division of trauma. But before we do that, just so that we follow some sort of trajectory, I wanted to know why you felt like you could write My Body Keeps Your Secret now. Was it because of the buzz around your first book, or was it that you just felt like that the world of readers, the world of women and men and everyone in between were interested in hearing about how physicality can be completely destroyed by trauma?
Yeah, I think it is definitely more the latter. It was just this sense I felt like maybe now is the time to be having this conversation. I felt like people wanted to talk about it more and more.
Is that because the political landscape, because more and more women were speaking up because of the Me Too movement, or is that because?
Yeah, I think so. I do think it's connected to that. Yeah. I think the kind of explosion of the current iteration of the Me Too movement set up an environment where people felt a bit more able to speak freely about their experiences. And what that led to was conversations that were just more nuanced about what these experiences actually do to us and what trauma is, you know, and how we treat it.
But I'm interested in this sort of notion now, because of course after the Me Too movement, lots of women have come forward, as they should, and talked about their trauma, including you. But I wonder whether it's that bit of that double-edged sword for someone like you that is a writer already, who is a journalist already, that you, by presenting yourself so firmly on the world, saying, this is what happened to me, this is something that I've researched, this now becomes me. Are you going to be that woman that writes about trauma?
Yeah, you know, I think about this all the time.
I'm so sorry. I don't know whether, you know, because I just wonder about, are you now going to be forever defined as this woman that was brave enough to put her feet down?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, thank you for that question. I think it's such a great question. And I think it's a really important thing to talk about, because I think it's something that people think about a lot. And to be honest, I don't have a good answer for it. I go back and forth on this.
Go on.
You know, I never want to write about this again. I just want to watch The Good Wife on repeat for the rest of my life. And
I'm with you on that, can I just say? I'm with you.
I'm so glad. It's the best show on TV. Anyway, sometimes, you know, I think I want to, you know, this second book, maybe that's the end of this project and I can move on to writing about something else. And then sometimes I think there's still more to be done here. You know, there's still so much work to do. And I want to be thinking about this and how we can change our society to better understand trauma and better help people who have been traumatized and understand the impact of sexual violence. And so, you know, I don't want to be defined by it necessarily, but there is a part of me that wants my kind of life's work to be defined by it, if that makes sense.
You know what, it just makes me realize again, and of course anyone that reads your book, Lucia, will understand this, is that this is in some, and it has been described as this is a manifesto. You are putting women's stories, people's experiences on the forefront, including your own. You're not shying away from your own at all. And of course, if you've laid down those rules, if you've laid down that scripture, then there's nowhere else for you to go. You have to move forward. You've been kind of branded, I would have thought, in a sense. Yeah. Can we hear a little bit about your book from you. Can you do a little reading for us?
Yes, of course.
That would be so grand.
Yes, that sounds good. It would be a good way to stop me from talking about The Good Wife more. So I'm going to read a bit from the first chapter of the book. So this book is, the way it's structured is each chapter kind of goes through either one woman's story or a few people's stories, and it kind of moves chronologically over a life. But the opening chapter kind of sets up the ideas in the book. So I'm just going to read from that. So it starts with a quote from Olivia Lang, a book called The Lonely City. So much of the pain of loneliness is to do with concealment, with feeling compelled to hide vulnerability, to tuck ugliness away, to cover up scars as if they are literally repulsive. But why hide? I thought I had mastered the art of anti-concealment. I thought that by writing that book, I Choose Elena, I had vanquished my need to be invulnerable. I thought I had escaped loneliness by allowing myself to be seen. But I hadn't. I was still ashamed. It was the everyday, insidious shame that hurt me most. The bodily shame that creeps into friendships and work and relationships. The kind that has both nothing and everything to do with my sexual assault. The kind that I share with women and non-binary people all over the world who have and have not had experiences like mine. Their everyday shame also has nothing and everything to do with my sexual assault and theirs. Shame and violation is a long-running war, and the everyday scars are the foot soldiers. I spent 12 years thinking almost exclusively about my body. It was the only thing on my mind. As a semi-professional gymnast, I would be constantly appraising its power, its strength, what it needed from me, what it was asking for. Then I spent 10 years not thinking about my body at all. Because I had told no one about my sexual assault, I had no way of understanding the acute dissociation I started experiencing in its aftermath. All of a sudden, my body felt so far away. It was a crime scene, and I wanted to run from it and never look back. I started to ignore it, its sensations, its desires. But the thing about living in a human body is that you cannot transcend it, no matter how hard you try. It is with you every day, every minute. You cannot leave it behind. You cannot change what it has seen as experienced. You just have to find a way to live with it. I know that now. I have always been a perfectionist and a desperate overachiever, and I thought I could challenge my mind to erase my assault and carry on as normal. In the same way, I could challenge it to learn my English essays off by heart in high school, but I was wrong. As I was deciding whether to disclose my assault, I read a book by the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. It is all about how the body remembers what the mind has suppressed, about how the body will carry scars of our experiences forever, no matter how badly we want to erase them. That phrase just kept ringing in my ears for weeks. The body keeps the score. The body keeps the score. The body keeps the score. As soon as I read that phrase, I knew it was true.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And that does give everybody a bit of a taste of what this book is. I want to talk about how you gathered the stories, but before I do that, I want to just mention very briefly, and hopefully we will have time to come back to it, how delighted I was that not only did you collect the stories of women and non-binary people that had experienced trauma, but you also reflect a lot on what you've been reading, and you've said that in that passage there. And throughout the book, there are quotations and references to both fiction and non-fiction. But you did pick one of my favorites as well, Lucia, and I think it seems to be a good way to move into how you started collecting the stories. And it says here on page 56, you've got a quote from about the rabbit hole, going right down the rabbit hole here. And you said, I don't know how to talk about the rabbit hole without accidentally inviting you to follow me down in it. And I think that's such a beautiful way of saying, of course you had to gather stories. Of course, that's the way to make sense. I know that you spoke to hundreds of people, but you haven't got hundreds of people's experiences in your book. How did you make that sort of selection? What was it that sort of drove which stories you told and which ones you tucked away for safety?
Yeah, so this was almost entirely driven by my interview subjects themselves.
Yeah.
So I started, I had conversations with more than 100 people, and they all went over kind of weeks and months. And over that time, some people would decide that they didn't necessarily want to be in the book, and others would decide that they were okay with having their stories in the book. So primarily, it was just a case of, the people who wanted to be in there are the people whose stories are in there in detail. But also, I did try and make selections about the space I gave to different stories based on trying to be inclusive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I wanted, as much as I could, based on the people who came to me with their stories, I really wanted to put together something that didn't make it feel like Me Too and speaking up about is something for white middle-class women, as it so often, I think far too often it does feel like that. And, that's something I don't like about the movement. And I really wanted to write a book that felt inclusive and that felt to people like they could pick it up and think, I'm reflected in here somehow.
I appreciated that. And there were so many really, really sad stories, Lucia. I know that many people that work in the sexual assault field talk about the trauma of just gathering people's stories, just having the layers and layers of experiences put into their own life. What's that been like for you?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I think it's very important to be aware of. And I think I was not particularly aware of it.
I'm so sorry, because it must have hurt. It's a heavy load to carry.
Yeah. And I think I should have been a bit better prepared for that. But I think I was just so excited about the project, and I was so excited about connecting with people,
Yeah, of course.
And it really is such a joy to be able to speak to someone you've never met before and feel like you just have this shared understanding of the world, and to know in that person's eyes that your perception of the world is real, and so it is such a joy, and that I think distracted me from the fact that it also is can be re-traumatizing when you're kind of speaking about these things all the time and hearing people's stories all the time. So I definitely learned over the process of doing these interviews to get a bit better at putting things in place to kind of protect myself. I relied very heavily on my therapist, and I will always kind of talk through with her things that come up in interviews that kind of might connect with something that's happened in my life.
Well, while you were sort of chronicling your story and other people's stories, your book also describes really the breakdown of your own relationship.
Yes.
This is not a love story for anyone that might be getting confused.
Yes, exactly. We should put that on the back of the book. Story.
It actually is a love story. It actually is. You know that, don't you? It is. It really is. It's all about.
Thank you.
It's all about
a different kind of love story.
That's
a
right.
Non-traditional one, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yes, I think that idea of relationships breaking down when you can't connect with someone over these kinds of things is an important part of this book as well, and it was something that came up for a lot of people that I spoke to.
Yeah, it's a sort of a common story, isn't it? That once a severe trauma has happened, does the relationship survive? Something like that.
Yeah. And of course, if it does, it becomes even stronger. You know, this is not to say that relationships can't. And I've spoken to loads of people for whom that was the case as well.
Yeah, that's good. That's good that we put that in, actually. That's good that you mentioned that. But the sort of social issues of trauma that you approach in your book, where you start talking about, and you did reference it just earlier, where you start talking about the sort of the class system, because therein lies another level of trauma for so many people.
Mm-hmm.
For us to deny that Western society is based on class would be doing many, many people a disservice.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, this is such a huge issue with trauma treatment, because the way the current system is set up, we see all of the really, really basic ways to treat trauma as essentially optional, and therefore they are expensive. So, you know, it's very, very hard to find a trauma specialist, like a specialist therapist, who will take you through some of the, you know, really effective trauma treatments. It's really hard to find someone like that who you can get access to for free. Certainly in the UK, it's very hard. In Australia, it's a bit of a better system in terms of accessing mental health care without having to pay for it sometimes. But, you know, still, it's just nowhere near enough. And the truth is that most people who access this kind of care are the people who are able to pay for it. And that means that you are completely separating society into the people who can access trauma treatment and the people who can't. And that is...
And I guess even in the very first instance, those people that can articulate the trauma, because they have had, you know, the experiences of education and a supportive family, compared to those.
Exactly. Totally. And those structural elements are hugely important to being able to make a disclosure and being able to go to a doctor and say, this has happened to me. And, you know, there are just so many barriers that you have to get over, so many hoops that you have to jump through before you can access treatment. And at every single stage of those, people are better off if they are wealthier and middle class, and then it means that, you know, everyone who is not falls out of that process and doesn't get to access trauma treatment, and that can impact a whole life, and that is just so unfair.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Some of the stories that you talk about in there, I'm thinking about Charlie in the UK. Perhaps you could tell our listeners a little about her.
Yes. So Charlie is a person I spoke to who was a member of the BDSM community. Is this right? Are we thinking about the same person?
That's exactly right. Yep. Thank you.
Just wanted to double check. I get, because I have their real names in my head.
Of course. Now you have to do a little. I
get confused about pseudonyms, which I shouldn't, because
it's like doing algebra.
Lived in their pseudonym life for a long time now, but because when I think about their faces, I think about their real names, so then I get a bit confused. Yes. So Charlie was someone who lived here in the UK and was a member of the BDSM community and used a lot of like websites and online apps to meet people. And we now know.
I'm interested in all of that, because I know that there'll be so many people that are frightened of the different sort of apps that are happening at the moment. There are people that, they understand that there's a risk associated with it. So that's
the thing. And, you know, we now know, and this wasn't out there as much when Charlie was on these apps, but we now know that they are terrible at reporting and getting rid of offenders on these websites. And it's it really needs to change. There needs to be some sort of legislative intervention or something, because these sites have so much power, and we know that even when people report that people are behaving badly, they don't do anything about it. Which was the case with Charlie. She met someone online who was very, very coercive from the beginning. He ended up sexually assaulting her. And he also, it turned out, had lied about his entire life, basically. And he was a vicar. He had a family. He had kids. He had a wife. And she had this kind of protracted interaction with him because he kept kind of stalking her, essentially, after he had assaulted her. And it was really hard for her to get away from him. And it was a really, obviously, really, really traumatic experience for her. And she got no support from the site itself, even though she reported him, and she knew that other people had reported him as well. And he's still on there. You know, there's still no action that's been taken against him to get him off there. And so other people, you know, it's just, it's a real problem. And Charlie moved cities and is now has now found a new community and is, you know, in treatment and is recovering really, really, really well and is just doing amazingly. But it's just, you know, one of those stories that unfortunately happen. It's absolutely shocking.
I imagine that those sort of stories are happening all over the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All the time.
All the time. They're happening all of the time. I mean, you do mention some that are completely horrific and in the book, but we will perhaps not talk about them tonight. Let's get back to who you are and the way that you write. I'm very interested that you referenced so many wonderful authors in your book. You're obviously somebody that reads widely.
Yes. I am obsessed with reading is the best way to. So the reason I hesitated is I don't want to say I read widely as in, like, you know, I read, like, I don't want to say that as if I'm just really disciplined and read a lot. It's just that I really love reading.
Yeah. And you always have.
And always have, exactly. And, you know, the thing about this period in my life, when I, you know, in 2017, 2018, when I got really sick, and then I finally made this disclosure and I finally spoke up to my doctors about my assault, it was a very difficult time for me emotionally. I was very overwhelmed. And I just turned to books, to be honest. I found everything else was too much. Yeah. I found even speaking to my friends was overwhelming, you know, but books are the perfect companion when you are in struggle, I think, because they are patient and they're kind and they don't expect anything from you. And I just found myself in this long period in my life where the only thing that made me feel like I could keep going was reading. And so I just started doing this thing where I would always know the next thing that I was going to read. So I would finish one book and just start the next one straight away. And I just found that, you know, being able to sit in a room with a book, and, you know, these all mostly ended up being books about trauma and about sexual violence in one way or the other, because
it's an extraordinary list at the back of your book.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much great stuff out there, and I just found that I wanted to read it all, you know, because I wanted to better understand what was happening to me. And
I was interested that you read some great classics, some great feminist sort of classics, where people actually, you know, like I don't know. Actually, I don't even know whether it's in there, but I'm sort of thinking of Marilyn French and Betty Friedman and people like that have actually been talking about the way that women hold trauma for decades
Yes.
and decades, and yet they're known instead for being women that broke down the glass ceiling or whatever, but actually they did so much more than that.
Yes, totally. And that's the incredible thing when you kind of read back about all of this, is that we have known this forever. You know, we know this in our bodies, and we have always known this, really. And people have been saying this for decades, and you can see these kind of little threads of it as you go back through the literature, and I really enjoyed that.
I really admire you, and thank you as a bookseller for saying that that books can bring you comfort, that books can move you through different types of trauma, because there you find other people's stories. There's a few questions coming in. People are asking if that in your darkest moments, when you were turning to the works of great authors, did you ever think about self-harming, or was it something that you could just move through because you had the comfort and the support of your family and of books?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did think about it. And I always found.
I'm sorry.
Pardon?
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's just, there are stages of processing trauma that are very difficult. And there were times when I thought about those kinds of things, but I always found that reading my favorite writers helped me with that. And sometimes it was, just reading the same book over and over and over again. There's a book I have by Leslie Jameson. It's her first essay collection. And, I have it in my bedside drawer all the time, because it always makes me feel a sense of comfort and a sense of connection.
When you go traveling or when you go on holidays, are you the type of person that takes hard copy books, or are you the person? Yeah, me too. Yeah. Because there's also something about the texture, right? About a book.
Yes, exactly. And I just want to have them with me. And there are some books that I take with me always, even though I've read them again and again. And Leslie Jameson's book is one of those. But it's interesting, I talk a lot in My Body Keeps Your Secrets about shame as an emotion and how shame is connected to trauma. And the thing is, when you're processing trauma, a lot of really, really difficult emotions come up. Shame is one of those emotions, especially when you've experienced a trauma like sexual violence that is stigmatized and that leaves you with a sense of worthlessness, or leaves you with a sense that you've done something to deserve what happened to you. And when you feel that shame, our kind of natural human instinct is to somehow duck away from that shame, somehow not feel it. And we have a lot of techniques to numb shame. And something that I didn't understand at all until I interviewed loads of experts about this. But, there are all sorts of behaviors that we engage in to try and not feel shame. So drinking is one of them. A lot of the people I spoke to for this book felt like they relied on alcohol when they felt shame, but also things like being really busy and being a perfectionist, and all of these kind of addictive or compulsive behaviors are ways to kind of not feel the shame that we're feeling. And I felt the pull of all of those things when I was processing this trauma. And writing and reading were also the things I felt that allowed me to kind of sit with my feelings without having to numb them, if that makes sense. So it was
well, it gave you the avenues to explore it rather than
exactly to kind of, I was going to say lean into it, I shouldn't use that expression, to kind of absorb it rather than run away from it. And I think that was a really important crutch for me. I think that those books were the reason I was able to sit with those feelings and actually analyze them and think about what they meant rather than just running away from them. And I think the power of literature to do that is really amazing. And I think, again, it's because it's this really beautiful art form where, you can sit alone with it and you don't have to respond immediately. And, the book isn't
you can take your time with your reaction to it.
You can take your time, exactly. And I really needed that. I really needed time. And that time was hours and hours spent reading. And I think that, I would say to anyone who is processing trauma, I think sitting and reading is one of the best things I did for myself.
You do talk about the shame that happens to so many people that have been assaulted, and so many people spoke about it to you. The other theme to me, the other theme, it seemed to me, was grief.
Yes,
And of course, reading it also helped with that. But is that something that came up often when you were speaking to? Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's a really important emotion. And again, one that as a society, we don't talk about very much. So therefore, we try not to feel it when it comes up.
Certainly, we don't speak about it in relation to trauma, in relation to an
Yes,
experience like that.
exactly. And I think, there is a real sense of grief and loss when you start to process trauma, because, the way that trauma impacts the brain, it means that you see the world differently, means that you see yourself differently.
It means that you lost something.
Yeah, exactly. It means that you lost something. And it's very hard, I think, to come to terms with that, especially when, someone in the world woke up one day and decided to take that away from you, and that we live in a world where, we think it's okay for these sexual assaults to happen, and people get away with them more often than they don't. And, so that grief is very strong, because you do have to recognize that you lost a part of yourself. And I know that all of the people I interviewed struggled with that. And they all said as well, though, that speaking about their experiences was, for them, one of the best ways to process that grief. So I thought that was really interesting to hear that from them. I think that was definitely the case for me as well.
I'm so glad. So when we talk about grief and we talk about sharing experiences, and that being an important part of the healing process, was that notion of sharing and someone listening, someone taking the time out, which is the same sort of feeling that we get when we read a book, that we're taking some time out, which is all part of a healing process. By the end, by the time you had written this book, by the time you had sent it off to the great publishers at Allen and Unwin, and they had come back and all the edits had been done and all the facts had been checked and the legal department had been through it, what was the emotion that was going through for you?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I felt so many things actually when I finished this book. I think the process of writing this and hearing all of these stories was actually a really important part of processing my trauma that I didn't quite expect. I thought, and this kind of comes up in the passage that I read before, I kind of thought that I'd done the hard part.
Yeah.
But this very, very difficult from a trauma perspective, and I didn't quite expect that. So I felt when this was finished, I felt a very strong sense that it was very important that I had done it. And I also felt quite overwhelmed, like a lot of emotions that came up as, a lot of the trauma emotions that come up.
Was it a healing experience for you?
Yes, definitely. And one that I didn't know I needed, I think. But honestly, speaking to these people, and I had to do most of these interviews during our 6-month lockdown. So a lot of these interviews started on Zoom, would be in different countries, different time zones, But speaking to these people really was so unbelievably helpful for me, because just the process of connecting with people and hearing their stories, and as I said before, kind of having this immediate understanding that we have a shared perception of the world, when that perception of the world can feel so lonely. And this is the other thing about shame, all of these people, for most of these people, I was the first person who had ever heard stories. So they'd never told these stories to anyone. And they were speaking them out loud for the first time. And they were feeling all of the emotions that come with trauma. And they were feeling completely isolated in those emotions.
And I imagine, and one of our listeners has made reference to that, there you are, you're describing this situation, this unreal, sort of surreal situation, if you like, that here you are talking to people across the world, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, different parts of the UK, and here they are telling you these incredibly intimate details about their lives. They're owning up to a horrific event that's happened to them. And all the time while this is happening, there's a pandemic going on around. That's the sort of the landscape of the time.
Yes. It's wild, you know. The thing is that was interesting is that the pandemic, because it is a very traumatizing thing. A lot of people were finding that their trauma responses were coming back with a vengeance, when the pandemic hit, because all of a sudden the world was totally out of control. Everyone was afraid, all of these feelings that for people who suffer from PTSD can bring up all sorts of different emotions. So it was interesting. That was often a jumping off point for our conversations. People would say,
so people are asking, how did you find these people? And I imagine there you are on your Zoom, and you start off, they've come to you through email or something like that in the first instance, and there you see them face to face, and you start off by talking about the pandemic, and then you sort of move on from a global situation to something that's very intimate. But how did you find them in the first instance? Where did all these people come from?
Yeah, great question. So when I decided I was going to do this book, I basically just did a call out on all of my social media accounts. And I said, I'd really like to speak to anyone who wants to talk to me about their relationship with their body and their relationship with trauma. And so I did that on my own.
Mention people on your social media would know who you are because of the wild success of your first book. So people knew who you were. Yeah.
Yes. But then I also, sent emails out through survivors groups and women's groups, and I kind of, put up some posters and things like that. And I just left my number and my email address and said, call me if you want to talk, basically. And then I just got loads and loads of responses, and just kind of then just started speaking to everyone. I would just jump on a Zoom call with everyone that wanted to speak, and then I just
taken hours.
Yes, it was a very, very involved process doing all the interviews for this book, but it was so rewarding.
Thank you for taking the burden of listening to other people's stories.
No, it was my pleasure.
Carola here in the audience is asking about how you've spoken already about grief, about something that you've lost. Mm-hmm. And she wants to know, what do you now think you lost, and what have you found at this point of time in your healing journey?
Great question.
It is actually a really great question.
It's a really good question. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I wish I came up with that one.
Yeah. This is so interesting. So, I do think there is something that I have lost, and I think that is, a sense of total safety in the world, or a sense that the world was built with my safety in mind, which
so a confidence.
And that's a sense that you often have as a child and as a teenager, and I think that was taken from me. But I do think, to the second part of the question, I have gained so much in the place of what I have lost, and that is just a really, really different perspective on life and on the world, because I have been forced to think about violence and about what it does to people, and about how we can try and prevent it. And I wouldn't have had that perspective otherwise. And I also think I've gained so one of the things that I write about in the book is that empathy is the antidote to shame and trauma. Empathy and connection, and Brené Brown talks a lot about this, that empathy is the way out of shame. And she said years and years before the current kind of Me Too moment, she said in one of her books, the most powerful words when someone is suffering are "Me Too." So one thing I have definitely gained is a stronger sense of empathy and a stronger ability to connect with other people based on what people have experienced, what I have experienced. And I really value that. I think that, empathy really is one of the things that got me through. And now I prioritize it over almost everything else. And I didn't have that perspective before.
I was really interested that you talk about Brené Brown's work and in relation to empathy, because I know that she also speaks about vulnerability. And I was just thinking as you were speaking then, that actually to be truly empathetic, you have to also be vulnerable to your own, sort of access to your own sense of self. And that's what you've done with this book. You have said to all of these people that have shared stories, hey, I understand, I'm listening, and here's my story alongside your story. My story is different to your story, just like every story is different.
Yeah.
But I'm actually going to be courageous enough to be vulnerable, kind enough to be empathetic, and I'm going to take all of these people's experiences and make it into something that's accessible for all of us. So on behalf of all of your readers, Lucia, thank you so much. Thank you for doing that and being that tough, brave, independent woman. I've got a couple more questions to ask you. And then we've run out of time and you have to start your busy London day and I have to go and have an enormous gallon of wine. But I want to know, because you're this terrific reader and you've mentioned so many great authors throughout your book and so many of my favorites, I want to know, what is your favorite non-fiction and your favorite fiction in relation to My Body Keeps Your Secrets?
Great question. So for
question, I would like to use the tough question.
So in terms of fiction, I think my favorite book in relation to this and all this research is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara,
which is just almost a list of terrible things, isn't it? Like it just goes from one traumatic experience, which is, to the next. It's mind-blowing, but written with such panache and such softness in a way.
Exactly. And that book taught me a lot about trauma. Reading that book was, I think, one of the first times some part of my brain understood that this was part of my story. Because that is a book about how trauma affects a life and how it stays with you even if you try to forget about it.
Even if you're safe.
Yeah, exactly. And I wasn't conscious, but I think it was the first time I made that connection. And I really think that I can credit that book with kind of starting this whole journey. And also, so many people criticize that book for being too sad or there being too much violence or too much trauma in it. And I went to see her speak at the Sydney Writers' Festival in 2015, I think. And she dedicated her talk to that criticism. And I go back to this, I listen to the podcast of it probably once every few months. It's kind of one of my talismans, I rely on it so heavily. Because what she says is, this criticism, when people say to me, there's gratuitous violence in this novel, there's too much sexual violence, it's gratuitous. And she says to them and to the audience, she says, all violence is gratuitous. What do you mean there's a certain amount of violence that is good or good for the story or something like that? She's saying all violence is gratuitous, all violence is unnecessary. What I'm portraying to you is in fact a realistic amount of violence. And what she says is, if you think this is unrealistic, if you think this doesn't happen to people, then you need to read this book more than anyone else, because this is real. You know, people live lives defined by violence, and if we can't accept that, then we'll never change it. And the other thing that she says in this address, she says, I wanted this book to be an exercise in empathy. And she says, the thing about Jude, the main character, is that he has terrible things happen to him. He does terrible things to himself. But if you love him as much as I love him, you will stay with him even when it would be easier not to. And she says that's what empathy is. It's not looking away. You know, it's staying with someone even when it would be easier to look away. And I find that so powerful. And I think that's what all the people in this book deserve and need, you know, that empathy of staying with their stories, even when their stories are difficult, because they're real. And that's the only way that we can recover and move on. So that's a very long way of saying that's my favorite fiction book.
Non-fiction.
And yes, and my non-fiction would have to be The Body Keeps the Score by Beth.
Yeah,
because that's kind of that's another one of my talismans. And actually my doctor, when I first told him that I had been assaulted, and the first time he said to me, I think this is connected to your Crohn's disease. And I kind of said, how, you know, I had none of this in my head at this time. And he said, I want you to go home and read a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And normally I would have just gone on with my life and gone on with being too busy to think about anything. But for some reason, I picked up the book on the way home and I read it as soon as I got home, and then everything changed.
It seems a fitting way to finish, because you did start your beautiful reading with quotes from that book. Thank you for all of this. I do hope that you're writing still. I do hope that we can expect more from you. Yes?
There is another one coming.
There's another one coming. That's what we all want to hear, because we need people that are leaders. And in a sense, this is what you're doing. You're showing us that it's okay to speak of past experiences, however long ago they may have been. It's okay to speak about them the next day, or 10 years later, or 25 years later. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Whenever you're ready. And if you know someone that has experienced something like that, the very best thing that you can do, which is something that you note many, many times in your book, is just to listen. It's just to sit there and listen, however long it takes.
Exactly.
Thank you, Lucia, for your time today on behalf of Clunes.
No, thank you.
I remember hearing about your book maybe about a year or so ago, and the people from Allen Unwin were so excited to have you. And I can see why. Congratulations to you. And
thank you.
What a joy to be speaking to you across the seas.
I know. Oh, and thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions. That was such a really, really amazing discussion, and that was all because of your wonderful questions. So thank you. And thank you to Clunes, and thank you to everyone who is here as well. And thank you to Readings. And I just, I really am very grateful to have these opportunities to talk about this book, because, you know, I know that it's a hard thing to talk about, and you all could have probably had a nicer time if you'd, you know, gone and watched a silly film.
Well, I do feel like that you have given some homework to our listeners, haven't you? You have actually said, if you haven't watched The Good Wife, TikTok.
Yeah, that's true. Go and watch The Good Wife. That is absolutely true. But yeah, I really appreciate you all coming, because, you know, I know it's difficult. And so I'm really grateful to everyone who comes and listens and reads this book and thinks about these things. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. So thank you.
Very kind. To you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then do we go back to you, Creative Clunes?
Yes, I just, unfortunately, tonight's been a night of technical errors on my end. My computer just decided to reboot. So I had a bit of a fright, and I thought I wouldn't be able to get back into the meeting. So I got in just in time to say thank you to both of you very much for your time this evening. And thank you to everyone who's joined. and have a lovely day in chilly London, and enjoy your wine, Chris.
Yes, enjoy your wine, Chris.
I'll raise a glass to you.
Yes, and we have recorded tonight, and I will send out a link tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.